Millionaire buys his family's old house to relive memories of the past. During renovations, he finds a letter that reveals hidden secrets from his childhood. The investigation leads him to uncover clues about a crime involving his own family. As secrets come to light, he finds himself torn between the truth and protecting his daughter. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. The Almeida mansion stood imposingly on the hill of the oldest neighborhood in Sao Paulo, like a silent sentinel guarding secrets from decades past. Michael Almeida, 45, observed the property through the windshield of his Range Rover, feeling the weight of memories on his shoulders. 25 years had passed since he last set foot in that place, and now, as a successful tech entrepreneur, he was returning to buy what was once his home. The garden, once meticulously cared for by his mother, Helen, was now a tangled mess of wild vegetation. Vines had taken over the stone walls, and the French windows, dusty from time, reflected the afternoon sun like the opaque eyes of a slumbering giant. "Are you sure you want to do this, Dad?" The voice of Sophia, his 19-year-old daughter, brought him back to reality. She was sitting in the passenger seat, her brown hair tied in a careless ponytail, her green eyes, so much like her mother's, staring at him with a mix of concern and curiosity. "I am, Sophia. After the divorce, I realized I needed to reconnect with my roots." Michael turned off the car and took a deep breath. The air smelled different here, a mix of wet earth and jasmine, just as he remembered. The real estate agent, Mrs. Marcia, was waiting for them at the main gate. She was a woman in her 60s, with neatly styled grey hair and a professional smile on her lips. "Mr. Almeida, what a pleasure to finally meet you in person. When I found out the buyer was the son of Helen and Richard Almeida, I could hardly believe it." Michael noticed a slight tremor in her voice when she mentioned his parents' names, but chose to ignore it. They followed the stone path to the main entrance, where an old marble fountain, now dry and cracked, still maintained its decaying elegance. The house was exactly as it appeared in the listing photos, 3 stories of Portuguese colonial architecture, with its majestic columns and wrought iron balconies. Time had been unkind, but the structure remained solid, as if patiently waiting for his return. As they entered, the smell of mold and abandonment greeted them. Sophia sneezed a few times, while Michael walked through the entrance hall, his footsteps echoing on the Italian marble floor. Memories hit him like flashes, his mother playing the piano in the music room, his father in his always closed office, the formal Sunday dinners. "The price is well below market value," Mrs. Marcia commented, breaking the silence. "The house has been abandoned for 15 years, since the last owner—" she hesitated. "Well, since it was put up for sale again." Michael nodded, climbing the main staircase. Each step creaked under his feet, as if the house were waking from a long slumber. On the second floor, he stopped in front of his old bedroom. The door was locked, but he knew the key should still be. "Dad, look at this!" Sophia called from another room. She was in her grandparents' old bedroom, pointing at something on the wall. As he approached, Michael noticed an irregular mark on the vintage wallpaper, as if something had been hastily removed. "Probably a painting," Mrs. Marcia said quickly, but her smile faltered for a moment. Michael approached the wall, running his fingers over the mark. There was something familiar about that empty space, something that made his heart race for no apparent reason. It was then that he noticed a small yellowed piece of paper fallen behind a loose baseboard. "The house needs a complete renovation," Mrs. Marcia continued, her voice sounding strangely anxious. "But I'm sure with your budget, Mr. Almeida, you can turn it back into the jewel it once was." Michael discreetly pocketed the paper, deciding to examine it later. "I'll take it," he declared, surprising even himself with the quick decision. "Can we handle the paperwork today?" Sophia looked at her father with a worried expression, but said nothing. She knew that determined look, the same one he had when he decided to divorce her mother 6 months ago. As Mrs. Marcia made calls to expedite the process, Michael returned to the entrance hall. The crystal chandelier, covered in cobwebs, swayed slightly in the breeze coming through the open windows. For a moment, he thought he heard a whisper, as if the house were trying to tell him something. "What are you hiding?" he murmured to himself, his eyes scanning the shadows in the corners and the dusty portraits on the walls. The Almeida mansion held secrets. He could feel it. And now, after so long, he was determined to uncover them. The mansion's renovation began a week after the purchase. Michael had hired the best architecture and construction team in the city, led by Amanda Torres, a professional renowned for her expertise in historical restorations. It was a Monday morning when the first workers arrived, bringing with them the noise of life that the house hadn't known in so long. "We need to start with the garden," Amanda explained, her red-framed glasses sliding down her nose as she consulted the blueprints. "There's a serious issue with foundation infiltration, and the overgrown vegetation is compromising the exterior walls." Michael agreed, watching from the window of the makeshift office he had set up on the first floor. Sophia had decided to spend a few weeks with him, claiming that her college architecture break would be better spent following the renovation. But he knew there was more to her decision. Since the divorce, she seemed torn between loyalty to her mother and concern for him. "Dad, I found some interesting things in the attic," Sophia said as she entered the office, carrying a dusty box. "They're family albums and some old documents." As they sifted through the contents of the box, a yellowed envelope fell to the floor. It was correspondence addressed to his father, Richard Almeida, dated 1985. The letter was partially burned, but some words were still legible. "The agreement must be maintained. Consequences will be inevitable if the truth—" "Mr. Almeida," a worker's voice interrupted his reading. "We found something during the garden excavation that you need to see." In the backyard, near an old tree, the workers had discovered a wooden box buried in the ground. It was a sturdy cedar box with delicate carvings on the sides. What caught Michael's attention, however, was the bronze padlock that sealed it, still intact despite the years underground. "It must have been buried a long time ago," Amanda commented, examining the box. "Based on the wood's appearance and for the padlock style, I'd say it's at least 30 years old." Michael felt a chill run down his spine. 30 years ago was exactly when his family had left the house in a hurry, never explaining the true reason. With a pair of pliers, the padlock was removed, revealing the box's contents: a carefully folded letter and an object wrapped in black velvet. The letter, written in an elegant handwriting Michael didn't recognize, contained just a few lines. "To Richard, some mistakes cannot be undone, only hidden. What is buried must remain so. From Helen." "Helen? Grandma wrote this?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling slightly. Michael unwrapped the velvet object, revealing an ornate antique key. It appeared to be made of silver, with an intricate design on the handle resembling a rose entwined with thorns. That night, after the workers had left, Michael remained in his office, spreading out all the items they had found: the partially burned letter, his mother's message, and the mysterious key. Something didn't add up in the story he knew about. His family. A noise from upstairs caught his attention. "Sophia," he called, but there was no response. Climbing the stairs quietly, he followed the sound to his parents' old bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and a cold breeze escaped through the crack. As he entered, he found the window open, the curtains swaying gently. It was then that he noticed something on the antique dresser that hadn't been there before: a gold wedding band. Picking it up, he saw an inscription inside: R.A. and M.S. forever. R.A., Richard Almeida, his father. But who was M.S.? A creak in the hallway made him turn abruptly. For a moment he thought he saw a shadow moving, but when he stepped into the hallway, he found only an empty, silent corridor. Returning to the office, Michael found Sophia working on her laptop. "Dad, I was researching the history of the house and found something strange. The property was sold in 1985 for a price well below market value, even though it's such a valuable mansion." Michael frowned, suddenly remembering the partially burned letter they had found. 1985, at the year we moved. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the house, making both of them jump. Who could it be at this hour? Opening the door, Michael found himself face to face with an elderly man with grey hair and a penetrating gaze. "Good evening, Mr. Almeida. My name is Joaquin Mendez. I was your parents' lawyer for many years." Michael hesitated for a moment before inviting him in. There was something in the lawyer's expression that made him uneasy. Mr. Almeida, Joaquim began, his voice laden with tension, I'm here to give you some advice. Leave the past in the past. Some things were buried for a good reason. A chill ran down Michael's spine. The lawyer's words echoed those in his mother's letter. What could be so terrible that so many people wanted to keep it hidden? As he observed Joaquim's serious expression, Michael wondered if he really wanted to continue his investigation. But one thing was certain. Now that he had started unearthing the secrets of the Almeida mansion, there was no turning back. The days following Joaquim Mendez's visit were marked by palpable tension in the Almeida mansion. Michael divided his time between overseeing the renovation and diving deeper into his investigation of the family's past. Sophia, meanwhile, alternated between helping her father and trying to convince him to give up his search. Dad, what if Mr. Mendez is right? Maybe some things should stay in the past, Sophia argued during breakfast, flipping through an old photo album she had found in the attic. Michael sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. I can't, Sophia. There's something bigger here than we realize. I feel like I owe it to my mother, to my father, to us. It was then that Sophia let out a surprised exclamation. Dad, look at this. She pointed to a photo in the album. It was a picture of a family picnic, dated 1984, in the corner of the photo, almost hidden, was the same woman from the torn photograph they had found in the safe. Who is she? Sophia asked, intrigued. Michael examined the photo closely. The woman was smiling, her arm linked with his father, Richard. His mother, Helen, was on the other side, her smile not reaching her eyes. I don't know, but I'm going to find out, Michael murmured, quickly typing a message on his phone. Hours later, Amanda, the architect, hurried into the office. Mr. Almeida, we found something during the roof restoration. I think you'll want to see this. In the attic, among the old beams, the workers had discovered a hidden compartment. Inside was a dusty shoebox. Michael opened it carefully, revealing its contents, yellowed letters, all addressed to his father, Richard Almeida. With trembling hands, Michael opened the first letter. The handwriting was the same as the message they had found in the box buried in the garden. As he read, his face paled. My dear Richard, the letter began, I can no longer bear this secret. Mariana deserves to know the truth about her origins. We cannot continue living this lie. Mariana? Sophia asked, reading over her father's shoulder. Who is Mariana? Before Michael could answer, the doorbell rang. Descending the stairs, he opened the door to find a middle-aged woman with familiar eyes staring at him with a mix of anxiety and determination. Hello, Michael, she said, her voice trembling slightly. My name is Mariana Silva. I think it's time we had a talk. The shock of the revelation was interrupted by the sound of screeching tires on the street. A black car sped away. Michael caught only a glimpse of the driver, but recognized the tense face of Joaquim Mendez. Mariana was invited inside, and soon, the three of them, Michael, Sophia, and the newcomer, were seated in the partially renovated living room. The silence was heavy, filled with unasked questions and secrets about to be revealed. I don't know where to start, Mariana said, wringing her hands in her lap. I've spent so much time imagining this moment, and now... Michael took a deep breath, gathering his courage. You're my sister, aren't you? Mariana nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Half-sister, actually. Daughter of Richard Almeida and Martha Silva. Sophia gasped, connecting the dots. MS on the ring. Exactly, Mariana continued. Our father had a relationship with my mother before marrying Helen. When she found out she was pregnant, Martha decided to raise me alone to avoid destroying Richard's marriage. Michael felt as if the ground were opening beneath him. Memories from his childhood began to rearrange themselves, taking on new meanings. The muffled arguments of his parents, the tense glances exchanged at family gatherings, the way his father sometimes seemed distant, lost in thought. But why all the secrecy? Why hide all of this? Sophia asked, her voice a mix of confusion and indignation. Mariana sighed deeply. Because there's more to this story than just an affair. The truth involves our father's company, questionable decisions and powerful people who prefer the past to remain buried. At that moment, Michael's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Be careful what you dig up. Some truths are too dangerous to come to light. Michael showed the message to Mariana and Sophia, a chill running down his spine. What else was hidden in his family's past, and who was so determined to keep these secrets buried? As night fell over the Almeida mansion, the three prepared for a long conversation. Outside in the darkness, a figure watched the house from afar. The glow of a cigarette briefly illuminating a familiar face, Joaquim Mendes. He murmured to himself, "God help us. The past is coming back to haunt us all." Mariana's revelation about being Michael's half-sister triggered a series of events that shook the already fragile foundations of the Almeida family. In the days that followed, Michael found himself immersed in an increasingly complex web of family and corporate secrets. On a cloudy morning, as the workers continued renovating the mansion, Michael received an unexpected visit. Carlos Mendonça, an old business partner of his father's, appeared unannounced, his face marked by age and worry. "Michael, my boy," Carlos said, his voice hoarse from decades of smoking, "I heard you're digging into the past. I came to give you some advice. Be careful what you might find." Michael led him to the office, noticing the nervous glances the man cast around the room. "Mr. Mendonça, I respect your concern, but I need to know the truth. What happened to my father's company? Why was it shut down so abruptly?" Carlos hesitated, running a hand through his gray hair. "Almeida Enterprises wasn't just a construction company, Michael. Your father, he got involved with powerful people, made deals that went beyond the business world." At that moment, Sophia entered the office, carrying an old box. "Dad, I found this hidden behind a loose panel in the attic. They're company documents." Carlos paled at the sight of the box. "My God, he kept everything." Michael began examining the papers, his heart racing with each document he read. Contracts with obscure clauses, transfers to offshore accounts, names of influential politicians and businessmen from the time. "Was Almeida Enterprises a front?" Michael asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. Carlos nodded slowly. "Not entirely. It started as a legitimate business, but Richard, he saw an opportunity to grow quickly. He made deals with underworld. Figures, laundered money through real estate projects." Sophia gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. "Grandpa was involved in illegal activities." "It was a different time," Carlos tried to explain. "The country was going through changes. There was a lot of money circulating without control. Richard thought he could play the game and come out unscathed." Michael stood abruptly, walking to the window. The mansion, which once represented his childhood memories, now seemed like a monument to secrets and lies. "What went wrong?" he asked without turning around. Carlos sighed deeply. "In 1985, there was an investigation. Richard realized the net was closing in. He decided to shut down the company and move, hoping everything would be forgotten with time." "And my mother? Did Helen know about all of this?" "Your mother?" Carlos hesitated. "Helen discovered part of the truth. That's why she insisted on moving, on selling the house in a hurry. She wanted to protect you, Michael." The sound of the doorbell interrupted the conversation. Sophia went to answer it and returned accompanied by Mariana, who seemed agitated. "Michael, we have a problem," Mariana said, casting a suspicious glance at Carlos. "I received an anonymous call. Someone is threatening to expose the whole story of Almeida Enterprises if we don't stop investigating." Carlos stood abruptly. "I need to go. Michael, please be cautious. There are people who still have a lot to lose if this story comes to light." After Carlos left, Michael, Sophia, and Mariana gathered to discuss their next steps. It was then that they noticed an envelope that had been slipped under the door during the commotion. Inside the envelope, they found an old photo. In it, Richard Almeida appeared next to a man Michael recognized immediately, the current state governor, Victor Albuquerque. "This explains a lot," Mariana murmured. "Governor Albuquerque was a rising businessman at the time. If he's involved, we need to be careful," Michael interrupted. "We're dealing with powerful people." That night, as a storm brewed on the horizon, Michael stayed awake in his office, examining the documents. A flash of lightning briefly illuminated the garden, and for a moment he was sure he saw a figure watching the house. When Sophia entered the room the next morning, she found Michael asleep over the papers. As she gently woke him, she noticed something strange. "Dad, where's the photo of Governor Albuquerque?" Michael looked around, alarmed. The photo was gone, along with some of the most incriminating documents. Outside, Joaquin Mendez watched the mansion from his car, a file in his hands and a look of concern on his face. He murmured to himself, "I'm sorry, Richard. I can't let your son destroy everything we built." As the sun rose over São Paulo, illuminating the imposing Almeida mansion, it became clear that Michael's search for answers had awakened forces that had been dormant for decades. And those forces were now moving in the shadows, determined to keep their secrets buried at any cost. The morning after the mysterious disappearance of the documents brought an atmosphere of tension to the Almeida mansion. Michael, Sophia, and Mariana gathered in the newly renovated kitchen, discussing the events of the previous night in hushed tones. "Someone broke into the house," Michael said, his untouched coffee cup in front of him. "We need to tighten security." Mariana nodded, her face pale with worry. "Michael, I think it's time we seek professional help. I know an investigative journalist who can help us unravel this story." Sophia, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly stood up. "Before that, there's something you need to see." She led them to Helen's old bedroom. There, Sophia removed a loose piece of baseboard, revealing a small hidden compartment. From inside, she pulled out a worn leather-bound diary. "I found this last night while you were talking with Mr. Mendonça," Sophia explained. "It's Grandma, Helen's diary." Michael took the diary with trembling hands. As he opened it, a photo fell to the floor. It was a picture of Helen, young and radiant, next to a woman he recognized as Martha Silva, Mariana's mother. "They knew each other," Mariana gasped, picking up the photo. Michael began flipping through the diary, his eyes widening with each page. "It seems so, and quite well. Listen to this. April 1980. Martha came to visit me today. Her eyes were filled with guilt. She tries to hide it, but I know there's something between her and Richard. Should I confront them?" Sophia and Mariana leaned in, reading over Michael's shoulder. The diary's pages revealed a tormented Helen, torn between her love for her husband and her friendship with Martha. "July 1980, I discovered the truth today. Martha is pregnant. Richard begged for forgiveness, promised he would end it all. But how can I trust him now?" Michael read aloud, his voice choked with emotion. Mariana covered her face with her hands, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. "My mother never told me. She always said my father had died before I was born." They continued reading, discovering that Helen had decided to forgive Richard, but on one condition, that he completely cut ties with Martha and the child. September 1985. Richard is becoming more distant. The business consumes him, and I fear he's getting involved with dangerous people. I overheard a conversation about illegal money and corrupt politicians. What should I do to protect my son? It was then that they noticed the following pages had been torn out. The diary jumped directly to entries from 1990, with no mention of the events that led to the family's sudden move. "Someone removed the most important pages," Sophia concluded, frustrated. A noise from downstairs startled them. Descending the stairs quietly, they found Amanda, the architect, standing in the entrance hall with a shocked expression. "Mr. Almeida," she stammered, "we found something during the demolition of the library wall. I think you need to see this." In the partially demolished library, an old safe had been revealed, embedded in the wall behind a bookshelf. Michael recognized the model. It was identical to the one they had found in the basement. "We need the key," he murmured, rushing to fetch the ornate key they had discovered earlier. With a click, the safe opened. Inside, they found a yellowed envelope addressed to Michael in Helen's handwriting. "My dear son," Michael read aloud, his voice trembling, "if you're reading this, it means you've finally discovered the truth about our past. There's so much I wish I could tell you, but time and circumstances don't allow me. Just know that everything your father and I did was to protect you and—" Michael stopped abruptly. The letter ended there, as if Helen had been interrupted mid-sentence. "And what?" Sophia asked, anxious. Before anyone could respond, the sound of breaking glass echoed through the house. They ran to the living room to find a rock on the floor, wrapped in a piece of paper. The message was clear and threatening. "Stop now, or the next generation will pay for the sins of the parents." Michael looked at Sophia, his face pale with concern. The investigation had become too dangerous. But how could they stop now, being so close to the truth? That night, as the Almeida mansion was enveloped in darkness, a solitary figure watched from afar. Joaquim Mendez lit a cigarette, his face briefly illuminated by the flame. Beside him on the passenger seat was a folder full of documents, the torn pages from Helen's diary and other secrets he had sworn to protect. "Ah, Richard," he murmured. To himself, "What would you say if you saw what your son has unleashed? Perhaps it's time to reveal the final piece of the puzzle." With a heavy sigh, Joaquim started the car and drove away, leaving behind the mansion and its occupants, who had no idea of the revelations the next day would bring. The day dawned grey over the Almeida mansion, as if the sky itself reflected the tension hanging over its inhabitants. Michael, Sophia, and Mariana gathered in the living room, discussing the events of the previous night and trying to decipher the meaning of the threat they had received. "We can't ignore this," Mariana said, her voice laden with worry. "Whoever is behind this is willing to go far to silence us." Sophia, who had been working on her laptop, suddenly exclaimed, "Dad, Mariana, look at this." She turned the screen so everyone could see. It was an old news article dated 1986 about a mysterious fire at a warehouse owned by Almeida Enterprises. "The fire destroyed crucial financial records," Sophia read aloud. "The police suspected illegal activities, but the investigation was closed due to lack of evidence." Michael felt a chill run down his spine. "That must have been right after we moved. It seems my father was covering his tracks." The sound of the doorbell interrupted their thoughts. Opening the door, Michael found himself face to face with a middle-aged woman, her grey hair and sharp eyes behind thin-framed glasses. "Mr. Almeida, I'm Renata Campos, an investigative journalist. Mariana contacted me," she introduced herself, entering the house with an air of determination. In the following minutes, the group brought Renata up to speed on all their discoveries. The journalist listened attentively, taking notes and occasionally asking pointed questions. "This is bigger than we imagined," Renata concluded after hearing everything. "We're talking about a corruption network that spans decades, involving powerful figures from the business and political worlds." At that moment, Michael's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Meet me at Ibirapuera Park in 1 hour. Come alone, JM." "Joaquim Mendez," Michael murmured, showing the message to the others. "It could be a trap," Sophia warned, concerned. Renata interjected. "Or it could be our chance to get answers. Mr. Almeida, if you decide to go, let me prepare a discreet recording device. We need concrete evidence." An hour later, Michael was walking nervously through Ibirapuera Park, his heart racing and a small microphone hidden in his lapel. It was then that he spotted Joaquim Mendez sitting on an isolated bench, a thick envelope in his hands. "Michael," Joaquim greeted, his voice tired, "the time has come for the truth. What you've discovered so far is just the tip of the iceberg." "Why did you decide to tell me now?" Michael asked, sitting beside the lawyer. Joaquim sighed deeply. "Because your father, before he left us, made me promise that one day I would tell you the whole truth. He knew this day would come." With trembling hands, Joaquim handed the envelope to Michael. "Here's everything. Documents, photos, the torn pages from your mother's diary. The truth about Almeida Enterprises, about Governor Albuquerque, about—" A sudden sound made Joaquim stop speaking. Before Michael could react, a gunshot echoed. Through the park, Joaquim staggered, a red stain quickly spreading across his shirt. "Michael," Joaquim whispered, his voice weak, "be careful of the man in the grey suit. He's the key to everything." As Michael shouted for help, holding Joaquim in his arms, A figure in a grey suit quickly walked away, disappearing among the park's trees. Hours later, at the Almeida mansion, the group was gathered, trying to process the shocking events of the day. Joaquim had been rushed to the hospital, his condition still critical. "This has gone too far," Mariana said, her voice trembling. Someone tried to silence Joaquim permanently. Renata, who had been examining the documents from the envelope, let out a surprised exclamation. "My God, this changes everything. Governor Albuquerque wasn't just a business partner of Richard Almeida. He is—" Before she could finish, the mansion's lights went out abruptly. In the dark, they heard the sound of breaking glass and hurried footsteps. "Everyone to the basement now," Michael shouted, guiding the group through the darkness. As they hid in the secret compartment in the basement, they heard sounds of people searching the house above. Sophia held the documents tightly against her chest, her heart pounding. "What do we do now?" she whispered, fear evident in her voice. Michael looked at each face in the dark, his determination growing. "We fight. We expose the truth no matter the cost. It's time to end this cycle of secrets and lies, once and for all." Outside, sirens began to sound in the distance. The night promised to be long, and the dawn would bring a battle that would define not only the fate of the Almeida family, but also the future of many powerful figures who had been hiding in the shadows for decades. The first light of morning found Michael, Sophia, Mariana, and Renata cautiously emerging from the basement of the Almeida mansion. The house was in chaos, drawers overturned, paintings askew on the walls, papers scattered across the floor. It was clear that the intruders had been searching for something specific. "Are the documents safe?" Michael asked, looking at Sophia. She nodded, revealing the folder she had kept protected against her chest all night. "Everything's here, Dad, but what do we do now?" Renata, the journalist, was already on the phone. "I have contacts in the federal police. I'll call them immediately. This has gone beyond investigative journalism." While Renata made her calls, Mariana noticed something strange in the library. "Michael, come see this." On the library wall, where a family portrait had once hung, there was now a framed newspaper clipping. The headline screamed, "Tragedy. In the Almeida family, businessman Richard Almeida dies in fatal accident." "But that doesn't make sense," Michael murmured, confused. "My father died of a heart attack 5 years ago. Why would someone put this here?" Sophia approached, examining the clipping. "Look at the date, Dad. It's from 1990, but you told me Grandpa died in 2020. A heavy silence fell over the group. The implications were disturbing. If Richard Almeida hadn't died when everyone thought he had, what else in the family's history was a lie? The sound of sirens broke the moment of reflection. Through the window, they saw several police cars approaching the mansion. "Oh, thank God," Renata sighed. "They're my contacts." But the relief was short-lived. Along with the police, a black, imposing car parked in front of the house. From the vehicle emerged a familiar figure, Governor Victor Albuquerque. "This isn't good," Mariana murmured. The governor, accompanied by 2 burly bodyguards, walked purposefully to the front door. His face, usually serene for the cameras, was tense and determined. "Mr. Almeida," he called, his voice echoing through the garden. "We need to talk. Immediately." Michael exchanged glances with the others. With a nod, he indicated that he would speak to the governor, but not without precautions. "Sophia, take the documents to a safe place. Mariana, stay with Renata and be ready to release everything if something goes wrong." Taking a deep breath, Michael opened the door. "Governor Albuquerque, to what do I owe the honor?" The most powerful man in the state entered the mansion, his eyes quickly scanning the surroundings. "Michael, I come as an old family friend." "What you're doing? You're stirring forces you don't understand." "On the contrary, Governor," Michael countered, his voice firm. "I think I'm starting to understand very well." Albuquerque sighed, suddenly looking older. "Your father, Richard, was more than a business partner to me. He was—" At that moment, one of the police officers hurried in. "Sir, we found something in the garden. I think you need to see this." In the backyard near an old oak tree, the ground had been recently disturbed. The police with their shovels had unearthed something, a metal suitcase sealed and corroded by time. With trembling hands, Michael opened the suitcase. Inside, along with old documents and yellowed photos, was a letter addressed to him in his father's unmistakable handwriting. "My son," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means the truth has finally come to light. I'm not dead, as you were led to believe. I had to fake my death in 1990 to protect our family and many others. Governor Albuquerque isn't just my friend and partner. He's your uncle, my half-brother." The shock of the revelation made Michael stagger. He looked at Albuquerque, who now had tears in his eyes. "It's true," the governor confirmed. "Our father, your grandfather, led a double life for years. When we found out we were already adults, Richard and I decided to use our positions to correct the mistakes of the past, but you got involved in something bigger and more dangerous," Renata finished, having approached silently. Albuquerque nodded. "A corruption network that spans decades. We tried to dismantle it from within, but..." The sound of more sirens interrupted the conversation. Federal police cars were arriving in force. "Michael," the governor said urgently, "we have little time. The truth needs to come out, but in the right way. Lives are at stake, including your father's." Sophia, who had returned, looked at Michael with wide eyes. "Dad, is Grandpa alive?" Michael, feeling the weight of generations of secrets on his shoulders, made a decision. "Governor, your uncle, it's time to tell everything. No more secrets, no more lies. We'll face this together as a family." As the federal agents approached the mansion, the group prepared for a revelation that would shake the foundations of power in the country. The truth, buried for so long, would finally come to light, and with it the promise of redemption and perhaps a new beginning for the Almeida family. The main hall of the Almeida mansion, once the stage for luxurious parties and high society gatherings, now served as the setting for a tense and decisive meeting. Michael, Sophia, Mariana, Governor Albuquerque, and the federal agents crowded around the large mahogany table on which the newly discovered documents were spread. "Start from the beginning," instructed Agent Luciana Vasconcelos, the leader of the federal operation. Her penetrating gaze alternated between Michael and the governor, searching for any sign of hesitation. Michael took a deep breath before beginning. "It all started more than 4 decades ago, when my grandfather Anthony Almeida led a double life. He had 2 families, the official one with my grandmother, which produced my father Richard, and the secret one, which resulted in the birth of Governor Albuquerque." Albuquerque nodded, continuing the narrative. "When Richard and I discovered the truth, we were already adults. Instead of drifting apart, we decided to use our positions to correct the mistakes of the past. Almeida Enterprises became our tool for that." "Fair, but you got involved in illegal activities," interjected Renata, the journalist, her eyes shining with the excitement of the big story unfolding before her. "Yes and no," Albuquerque replied, his face a mask of regret and determination. "We discovered a corruption network that extended throughout the state, involving politicians, businessmen, and even members of the judiciary. We decided to infiltrate that network, gaining its trust to eventually expose it." Sophia, who had been examining some documents, spoke up. "But something went wrong, didn't it? That's why Grandpa had to fake his death?" Michael picked up one of the photos on the table, showing his father next to a man in a grey suit. "Who is this?" Albuquerque paled. "That's Carlos Mendonça. He was our main contact in the criminal organization. When he discovered our true intentions, he threatened to expose everything. That's when your father had to die to protect the operation and the family." Agent Vasconcelos frowned. "Are you telling me there's been an unauthorized covert operation going on for over 30 years? "Exactly," Albuquerque confirmed. "And believe me, we've gathered enough evidence to bring down some of the most powerful men in this country." Mariana, who had been silent until then, finally spoke. "But what about me? How do I fit into this story?" Michael looked at his half-sister with compassion. "You, Mariana, were an unexpected consequence. Our father genuinely fell in love with your mother during the operation, but he knew he couldn't expose her to danger, so he abandoned her," Mariana finished, tears glistening in her eyes. The sound of helicopters cut through the air, making everyone look toward the windows. Several official vehicles began arriving, surrounding the property. "It's the cavalry," Agent Vasconcelos murmured, a tense smile on her lips. "It seems your evidence has attracted a lot of attention, Governor." Albuquerque stood, his imposing stature contrasting with the vulnerability in his eyes. "Michael, Sophia, Mariana, you need to know that everything we did, no matter how controversial it may seem, was to build a better future, a future free from the corruption that was eating away at our state." Sophia, with tears in her eyes, hugged her newly discovered uncle. "But at what cost? Families were torn apart, lives were ruined." "And where is my father now?" Michael asked, his voice choked with emotion. Before Albuquerque could answer, the door to the room opened. A man with graying hair and a face marked by time entered, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Michael. "Son," said Richard Almeida, his voice hoarse with emotion. The shock of the revelation sent an electric wave through the room. Michael, unable to contain himself, crossed the space in a few strides and embraced the father he thought he had lost years ago. "How? Why?" were the only words he could stammer. Richard, with tears in his eyes, looked at everyone in the room. "Because the truth can finally come out. Because the sacrifices of decades are about to bear fruit." Agent Vasconcelos, recovering from the shock, approached with handcuffs in hand. "Mr. Almeida, Governor Albuquerque, you are in custody for questioning." As the federal agents began collecting the documents and escorting those involved, Michael felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Sophia, her eyes reflecting a mix of fear and determination. "And now, Dad, what happens to us?" Michael looked at his daughter, at Mariana, and then at his father, who was being led away by the agents. The Almeida mansion, a silent witness to so many secrets, seemed to whisper a promise of redemption. "Now, my dear," Michael replied, his voice firm despite the swirling emotions, "now we begin to rebuild. Not just this house, but our family and perhaps part of this country." As the sun set on the horizon, casting long shadows over the property, the Almeida family prepared to face the consequences of decades of secrets. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The truth, no matter how painful, had finally been unearthed. The days following the revelation at the Almeida mansion were a whirlwind of emotions and events. The national media went into a frenzy. Sensational headlines filled the newspapers, and television networks talked of nothing else. Almeida scandal, decades of corruption exposed, governor arrested, the end of an era, the covert operation that shook the country. Michael, Sophia, and Mariana found themselves at the center of a media storm. Reporters camped day and night in front of the mansion, waiting for any scrap of additional information. Inside the house, the atmosphere was one of exhaustion and reflection. Michael spent hours locked in the office, reviewing documents and preparing for the interrogations that were sure to come. Sophia alternated between comforting Mariana and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy in their lives. It was on a rainy afternoon, a week after the arrests, that the doorbell rang. Opening the door, Michael found himself face to face with Helen, his mother, whom he hadn't seen in years. "Mom?" His voice came out as a surprised whisper. Helen, now with completely gray hair and deep lines around her eyes, looked at her son with a mix of love and regret. "Michael, my son, may I come in?" The meeting in the living room was tense at first. Helen looked around, taking in the changes to the house that had once been her home. "I knew this day would come," she began, her voice trembling. "From the moment your father, when Richard decided to go through with the plan, I knew the truth couldn't stay buried forever." Michael watched her, conflicting emotions bubbling in his chest. "Why, Mom? Why didn't you tell me all these years?" Helen sighed deeply. "To protect you, my love. It was always to protect you. The corruption network your father and Victor were investigating, they wouldn't hesitate to use you against us." Sophia, who had been listening silently, interjected. "But Grandma, the cost was so high. Families were torn apart. Lives were destroyed." Helen nodded sadly. "Yes, dear, and that's a weight we'll carry forever. But you need to understand, what was at stake was much bigger than our individual lives." At that moment, Mariana entered the room, stopping abruptly when she saw Helen. The two women stared at each other, years of secrets and unspoken pain hanging between them. "You must be Mariana," Helen said softly. I'm so sorry for everything." Mariana, with tears in her eyes, simply nodded. The silence that followed was broken by the ringing of Michael's phone. It was his lawyer. "Michael, we have a hearing scheduled for tomorrow. The judge wants to hear from everyone involved. That includes your father and Governor Albuquerque." After hanging up, Michael informed the family about the hearing. "It's our chance to tell the whole truth, to explain why they did what they did." Helen took her son's hand. "Michael, there's something you need to know before that hearing. Something even your father doesn't know." Everyone in the room held their breath, waiting for the revelation. "The covert operation. It wasn't your father's or Victor's idea, it was mine." The shock was palpable. Michael looked at his mother as if seeing her for the first time. Helen continued, "Before I married Richard, I worked for an intelligence agency. When I discovered the extent of the corruption in the state, I decided to use my contacts and skills to do something about it. Richard and Victor were key players, but the original plan was mine." The revelation hung in the air, heavy and surprising. Sophia was the first to break the silence. "So, all of this whole covert operation started with Grandma?" Helen nodded slowly. "Yes, dear. And tomorrow at the hearing I intend to take full responsibility for everything." Michael stood abruptly. "No, Mum, I won't let you bear this burden alone. We're a family. We'll face this together." Mariana, who had been quiet, finally spoke. "All of us. Despite everything, we're a family." As night fell over the Almeida mansion, the family came together in a collective embrace, silent tears streaming down their faces. Tomorrow would bring immense challenges, but for the first time in decades they would face those challenges united, with no secrets between them. Outside, the reporters continued their vigil, unaware of the emotional scene unfolding inside the house. The full truth was yet to come, and the entire nation waited eagerly to hear the story of the Almeida family, a saga of love, betrayal, sacrifice, and finally, redemption. The courthouse was surrounded by a crowd of journalists, onlookers, and protesters when the Almeida family arrived. Camera flashes exploded from all sides as Michael, Sophia, Mariana, and Helen walked determinedly toward the entrance, escorted by a battalion of security guards. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. The room was packed with representatives from the media, politicians, businessmen, and ordinary citizens, all eager to witness what was already being called the trial of the century. Judge Anthony Mendez, known for his unshakable integrity, presided over the session. His austere face scanned the room before announcing, "This court is now in session to hear testimony in the case of the state versus Richard Almeida, Victor Albuquerque, and others." One by one, those involved were called to testify. Richard Almeida, still elegant despite his years of seclusion, was the first. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his firm voice echoing through the room, "what we did may seem, at first glance, an act of betrayal to the nation. But I ask that you hear our full story before passing judgment." Richard narrated how he discovered the extent of the corruption plaguing the state, how he and Victor decided to infiltrate the criminal organization to dismantle it from within. He spoke of the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the constant weight of secrecy. Victor Albuquerque next corroborated the story, adding details about the politicians and businessmen involved in the scheme. His voice trembled as he spoke of the threats they received, the constant fear of being discovered. Then, to the surprise of many, Helen Almeida was called to testify. She stood, her gaze determined, and walked to the center of the room. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her voice surprisingly strong, "the truth you're about to hear may shock many of you, but it's a truth that needs to be told." Helen then revealed her past in intelligence, how she was the mastermind behind the covert operation. She explained how she recruited Richard and Victor, how she planned each move over the decades, the pie. Room erupted in murmurs. Judge Mendez had to bang his gavel several times to restore order. Michael, seated in the front row, watched everything with a mix of pride and apprehension. Beside him, Sophia held his hand tightly while Mariana discreetly wiped away a tear. As the hearing continued, more names were mentioned, more schemes were revealed. It was as if an intricate web of corruption was being unraveled before everyone's eyes. The tensest moment came when Carlos Mendonça, the man in the grey suit, was brought in to testify. His testimony confirmed much of what the Almeida family had said, but it also brought to light new, shocking details about the extent of the corruption. After hours of testimony, Judge Mendez announced a recess. The Almeida family gathered in a private room, exhausted but united. "You were incredible," Michael said, hugging his parents. Helen smiled wearily. "It's not over yet, my son. The worst is still to come." And she was right. When the session resumed, the prosecution began harshly questioning each of those involved. The questions were incisive, seeking contradictions, trying to dismantle the family's narrative. It was during this cross-examination that Sophia, unable to contain herself, stood up. "Your Honor," she called, her voice trembling slightly, "I request permission to speak." The judge, after a moment of hesitation, nodded. Sophia walked to the center of the room, all eyes on her. "Ladies and gentlemen, I know I'm not an official witness in this case, but I am a witness to something equally important: the character of the people sitting in that dock." She then spoke about growing up in the Almeida family, about the values she had been taught, about the love and integrity she had always seen in her father, her grandmother, and, more recently, in her uncle. Yes, they made mistakes. Yes, they hid the truth for years. But everything they did was driven by a genuine desire to do what was right, to fight against an evil that was eating away at our state, our country. Tears were now streaming freely down Sophia's face, but her voice remained firm. "I ask that you look beyond the questionable actions, see the intention behind them, see the greater good they were seeking." When Sophia finished, a deep silence fell over the room. Judge Mendez, visibly moved, thanked her and announced that the verdict would be delivered the next day. As the family left the courthouse, once again surrounded by reporters and camera flashes, Michael couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Regardless of the outcome, the truth had finally been told. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of something new and better. Across the street, a solitary figure watched the scene. It was Joaquim Mendez, recovered from the attack, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He knew his testimony the next day could be decisive. With a heavy sigh, he turned and disappeared into the night, carrying with him the weight of decades of secrets and the key to the conclusion of this drama that had captured the attention of an entire nation. The sun had barely risen when the Almeida family arrived at the courthouse for the final day of the trial. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. Michael, Sophia, Mariana, Helen, Richard, and Victor walked together, a united front facing what was to come. The courtroom was even more packed than the day before. The buzz ceased when Judge Anthony Mendez entered, his grave expression indicating the weight of the decision he was about to deliver. "Before I announce the verdict," the judge began, "there is one final witness who wishes to speak. Mr. Joaquim Mendez, please come forward." A murmur ran through the room as Joaquim, still showing visible signs of the attack he had suffered, walked to the center. His gaze briefly met Michael's before turning to the judge. "Your Honor," Joaquim began, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I spent decades keeping secrets, believing I was protecting people and ideals. Today, I'm here to tell the whole truth, without reservation." What followed was a detailed and moving account. Joaquim spoke about how he was recruited by Helen years ago, how he helped orchestrate Richard's fake death, how he maintained contact with politicians and businessmen involved in the corruption scheme. The Almeida family, he continued, risked everything, their lives, their reputation, their relationships, to dismantle a corruption network that extended far beyond what any of us could imagine. They are not criminals, they are heroes. When Joaquim finished, the silence in the room was palpable. Judge Mendez thanked him for his testimony and, after a brief pause, prepared to announce the verdict. "This case," the judge began, "is unprecedented in our legal history. Before us are individuals who technically violated several laws. However, they did so with the intention of exposing and combating a much greater evil. The judge paused, his eyes scanning the room. After careful consideration of all the evidence and testimony, this court rules as follows. Richard Almeida, Victor Albuquerque, and Helen Almeida are found not guilty of the charges of corruption and fraud. A collective sigh of relief echoed through the room. Michael hugged Sophia and Mariana, tears of joy in his eyes. However, the judge continued, due to the unauthorized nature of their actions, they will serve a period of community service and will be ineligible for public office for 10 years. The judge then turned to the audience. As for the true criminals exposed during this trial, arrest warrants are being issued. This case marks the beginning of a new era of transparency and justice in our country. With a bang of the gavel, the trial was concluded. The Almeida family embraced, a mix of relief, gratitude, and hope taking hold of everyone. Weeks passed. The Almeida mansion, once the stage for so many secrets, was now transforming. Michael decided to convert it into a community center, a place where people could seek legal help and support against corruption. On a sunny afternoon, the family gathered in the mansion's garden. Richard and Helen, holding hands, watched Michael, Sophia, and Mariana working on the preparations for the center's opening. "Who would have thought," Richard murmured, "that after everything we'd be here like this?" Helen smiled, squeezing her husband's hand. "Perhaps this is how it should have been from the beginning. No secrets, no lies, just a family united." Michael approached, a smile on his face. "Are you ready? People are already arriving for the opening ceremony." As they walked to the front of the mansion where a crowd was gathering, Sophia whispered to Mariana, "It's strange, isn't it? After so much turmoil, I finally feel like we're home." Mariana nodded, tears of happiness in her eyes. "Yes, finally home." Michael climbed the steps of the entrance, facing the crowd and the cameras. Beside him were his parents, his daughter, his newly discovered sister, and the weight of decades of history. "Welcome," he began, his voice strong and clear, "to the Alameda Center for Justice and Transparency. This place, which for so long held secrets, will now be a beacon of truth and hope." As Michael spoke, the sun shone brightly over the Almeida mansion. The shadows of the past finally dissipated, giving way to a bright and promising future. The family that had once been divided by secrets was now united by a common purpose: to turn their story of redemption into a legacy of positive change for all of society. And so, under the blue sky of São Paulo, a new era began, not just for the Almeida family, but for all those who believed in the power of truth and the strength of family unity.